I hope you're already a fan of Gilbert and Sullivan Austin, and if you are, you already know that we are extremely fortunate to have Ralph MacPhail Jr., whom we affectionately call Rafe, as our artistic director. He is not only extremely skilled at what he does with us here in Austin and what he has done on stages and in elder hostels and other places around the country, but he is a world-renowned scholar on Gilbert and Sullivan. He is one of the ones recognized as the world-renowned. He doesn't want me to tell you this, but it's true. And so we are truly blessed to have him here as our artistic director. He has led us in raising the level of our productions year by year by year, and this year is no exception. So let me introduce to you our artistic director, Ralph MacPhail Jr.
Thank you very much, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Whenever Libby Weed, our beloved president of GSA, introduces me, I always know what a pancake feels like after it's had syrup poured all over it. But I couldn't be happier with my opportunities to come down here and share an affection for Gilbert and Sullivan with a lot of people dedicated to the preservation of the traditions associated with the Savoy operas. Those traditions go back about 125 years. So in the next 25 to 30 minutes, what I'd like to talk with you about is a little bit of the history of Gilbert and Sullivan, where Ruddigore fits into that history. And then I thought you might also be interested in knowing something of the process that we go through in order to get one of our grand productions before the audience. I should say that I absolutely love questions. So if you have questions along the way, don't hesitate to raise your hand and let me know, and I'll see what I can do to try to answer them. Speaking of questions, I was reminded of an elder hostel I taught at Bridgewater College several years ago. I remember that we met every morning from 10 to 11:30, Monday through Friday, and on Friday morning a nice little lady raised her hand on Friday, the 5th day, and said, which one wrote the words and which one wrote the music? So I thought maybe we better start from square one and tell you that the words always came first, and the words came from W.S. Gilbert. He was born in London in 1836 and died just outside London in 1911 in a heroic attempt to rescue a young lady that had gone swimming in his lake. He jumped in full pack to try to save her life, had a heart attack, and sank. Sir Arthur Sullivan was born 6 years later in 1842. He was Gilbert's junior, and he died in 1900, just about the time his beloved Queen Victoria died, and about the time Richard Doyley Clark, the entrepreneur who united Gilbert and Sullivan for 25 years, he died about 1900 too. But during the course of their partnership, which really spanned 1871 to 1896, these two remarkable men with totally different temperaments, with strong abilities in their own particular realms of endeavor, wrote together 14 works. The music survives for 13 of them. And I believe that these works will continue to be performed as they were written for as long as the English language is spoken and sung. It's often said, that writers don't think they write for immortality. Well, Gilbert and Sullivan were the Rodgers and Hammerstein, the Andrew Lloyd Webber, the Lerner and Lowe, the Rodgers and Hart of their era. They were writing for Saturday night. They weren't writing for immortality. But I really think they wrote for the ages. When you see Ruddigore tonight, please understand that we have not changed anything. There's a joke about making false income tax returns in Act 2. Audiences just think that's hilarious. They wonder how I slipped that in there. I didn't do that. W.S. Gilbert did it in 1887. And his works invariably wake up and captivate audiences and draw them in. And I really firmly believe, because I've been in this theater the last several nights, that you're going to enjoy his laughter, the laughter they create, the beautiful music, and also the opportunity they give companies like ours the chance to stage them using beautiful costumes and compelling sets, and give you a chance to take a break from whatever's troubling you now and just sit back, relax, and have an awfully good time. Well, the two men met for the first time about 1870. And a man named John Holling, actually they met at a little theater called the Gallery of Illustration. A year before, Sir Sullivan, then Mr. Arthur Sullivan, had written with Frederick Clay a little entertainment. It lasted about an hour and a quarter, called Ages Ago. And in ages ago, in the middle of it, 5 portraits that are displayed in the set on the stage come to life magically. Well, if you've read the publicity or you're a Savoyard, you know that the real gimmick and the highlight, really, of Ruddigore is the fact that the ancestral portraits in Ruddigore Castle become animated. They come to life. Well, here they met over rehearsals for a one-act play when Sir Arthur Sullivan, then Mr. Arthur Sullivan, introduced Mr. W.S. Gilbert, or was introduced to Mr. W.S. Gilbert by Sullivan's friend, the composer Frederick Clay. Richard Doyley Carte was a young man who probably saw their first collaboration. They collaborated a year later on a Christmas entertainment called Thespis, or The Gods Grown Old. If you know English drama, the popular theater, you may be familiar with English pantomime. It's not really pantomime in the Marcel Marceau sense, but a type of sort of hybrid theatrical revue, musical comedy, high-spirited, linked with the Christmas season. And many theaters present, and continue to present to this day, Christmas pantomimes that run for a fairly limited run, usually a month or 2, and then they're replaced by the rest of the legitimate season of the theater. Well, John Hollingshead brought Gilbert and Sullivan together to write a pantomime, or a pantomime-like work. It's called Thespis of the Gods Grown Old, and it tells the story of the ancient gods on Mount Olympus who decide to go down and find out why the sacrifices have fallen off. And they hire a troupe of actors to come up and take their place. Well, if you know Gilbert and Sullivan and the way he likes to turn things topsy-turvy and upside down, you can imagine what happens. What happened to us, though, is something really unfortunate, and that is that the work was never revived and the score has been lost. So other than a chorus that was later used in The Pirates of Penzance, Climbing Over Rocky Mountain, and a song called Little Maid of Arcady, very little of the music survives. However, we're all hopeful. I hope to live long enough to find that score. In fact, about a generation ago, some folks working up at the Pierpont Morgan Library in New York were studying one of Sullivan's autographed scores, and they found the ballet music from Thespis tipped into the back of the score. So we have a little bit more music than we did about 30 years ago, but still it seems likely that we're not likely to find his score. Thespis it's often said in the lore that Thespis was a failure. But if you look at the runs for the Christmas pantomime season, Thespis ran longer than most of the other pantomimes. Oh, it wasn't anything like hundreds of performances like the Gilbert and Sullivan operas would later attain, but still it was not a financial or a failure in the sense of a short run. However, it didn't lead to much, simply because when Gilbert and Sullivan wrote for the so-called Gaiety Theater, he was writing for a group of entertainers, actors, singers, acrobats, specialty acts, and had to tailor his work to incorporate all of those people into what they had to do. The Payne brothers were acrobats, so their little shtick had to somehow be worked into Thespis. You can imagine how Gilbert, a strong man of the theater who knew exactly what he wanted to do, reacted to such strictures. He wasn't happy about it. So in other words, Thespis didn't go anywhere. It did not lead to anything, except that probably Richard Doyley Carte, an enterprising young promoter of singers and instrumentalists, probably saw it. And probably he saw there that Gilbert and Sullivan may be the ones to help him realize a dream he had had for years. And that dream was to create a type of English comic opera. At the time, comic operas were imported from France, those things by Offenbach. Do I have to tell you what those things were all about? Do I have to tell you what the Victorian prudery was all about? Can you see how French operetta might not work so hot for or maybe it was too hot for an English audience? Well, Richard Doyley Carte felt that real English operas written and composed by English artists and presented for English audiences could be successful. And with Gilbert and Sullivan, he gave it a try. He brought them together. He needed an afterpiece for an Offenbach opera called La Péricole, still very popular in the repertory, but he needed something to flesh out the evening. He was talking to W.S. Gilbert one day, and Gilbert said, well, I have a little one act I call Trial by Jury. It was going to be composed a couple years ago, but it fell through. And Doyley Carte said, well, grab it and take it over and show it to Arthur Sullivan. Well, the story goes that he read it to Sullivan, and he slammed it closed as if he was disappointed with all he had written. And as Sullivan wrote later, he didn't realize that he was trying to suppress his laughter all the way through. Well, he sat down, he composed it in 2 weeks, And perhaps for some of you, I don't have to tell you how brilliant Trial by Jury continues to be. We presented it on this stage back for 2 performances back in February, I think it was, this year. And not changing a word, not changing a syllable, not changing the music, except we had to use piano accompaniment. But still, it woke up beautifully. Well, Richard Doyley Carte had a hit on his hands, and it wasn't La Pericole, it was a little 45-minute afterpiece that the world and his wife, as they said in those days, came to see in the Victorian Theatre. Well, he had to raise some money because Gilbert and Sullivan decided if you want us to write a work for you, you have to come up with some ready cash. So he formed a thing called the Comedy Opera Company by raising money from some other investors, and in 1877 they presented The Sorcerer. We presented The Sorcerer here, I think it was 2 weeks ago. It was a very seminal work, a very charming work, and showed many of the characteristics of the later Gilbert and Sullivan operas, but early. And well, that worked pretty well, and they commissioned another one, and that one happened to be HMS Pinafore in 1878. And I probably don't have to tell you that HMS Pinafore is pretty well known today. In fact, I would be willing to guess that many of you saw an HMS Pinafore before you were 18 years old, and if you're a real Gilbert and Sullivan fan, chances are Pinafore drew you into this delightful subculture. So Pinafore has a lot to answer for, and I think all of it positive. Not only was it a great success in the English in the British Isles, but it also came across the United States. In those days, before international copyright, anyone who possessed a score and a libretto or the book of the words could present anything, and wouldn't have to pay royalties either. So there were literally hundreds of performances and productions of HMS Pinafore in 1878, 1879 in the United States. Well, that led to the Pirates of Penzance it opened in New York for the first time, an American premiere, not an English premiere. They were trying to preserve their copyright, didn't work. In 1879, and then came Patience, then Iolanthe and Princess Ida. In 1885, The Mikado, also a smash on both sides of the Atlantic. And it was in the shadow of The Mikado that Ruddigore, or The Witch's Curse, was written and composed in 1887. The Mikado was taken off the stage at the Savoy Theatre, where it was still selling out, in order to get the audience to come back and see something different for a change and to keep interested in Gilbert and Sullivan. However, Doyley Carte, much to his credit, kept the touring companies on the road throughout the English-speaking world, particularly England and Scotland and all that area, and they continued to perform these in every venue that could possibly hold an audience and a stage. Now, what is it about Ruddigore? Well, Ruddigore, in some respects, is the black sheep of the family. When it opened in 1887, several roughs in the audience shouted, "Take away this rot, give us back the Mikado." Well, what happened? What was the problem? Well, the critics thought it opened wonderfully with this wonderful village of Red Herring and a sparkling story of Rose Maybud and the Jolly Jack Tar, but they didn't like the idea of the ghosts at the very end coming back to life in the twinkling of an eye. And they didn't like the idea that in the special effects, the couple of the portraits stuck in their frames. Every time I sit out in the audience for a performance, I'm holding my breath until that scene is over. But Gilbert and Sullivan sat down and did some rewrites and some additions and some deletions and tightened it up. However, the Doyley Carte Opera Company, this bastion of Gilbert and Sullivan tradition that was on the road until 1882, well over a century, they didn't revive it until the 1920s. And you know what the irony is? The people that know most of the Gilbert and Sullivan operas that I have talked to, Ruddigore usually ranks really high. And I think the reasons are, as I tried to express in my program note, I won't repeat all that now, but you may want to look at that, is that the reason that it ranks highly with the fans is for the same reasons that Gilbert and Sullivan criticized each other for its relative failure. Sullivan's music and Gilbert's plot. Gilbert said that by Sullivan writing that score for the ghost scene, it was like putting 50 lines from Paradise Lost into a farcical comedy. Well, and then Sullivan was really tired at this point in his career of writing what he called his topsy-turvy works that strained credulity and just were, however logical, they just weren't at all realistic. Sullivan, the musician, wanted to write songs and music that expressed human emotion. And Gilbert and Sullivan are quite capable of doing that. Listen to Mad Margaret's aria tonight. Listen to the wonderful madrigal that opens the Act 1 finale, and you'll hear Gilbert and Sullivan at their musical and philosophical and emotional best, it seems to me. But always with Gilbert, whenever you get involved emotionally, hang on for a minute, because he's going to turn it on its head and you're going to be laughing because of his topsy-turvy approach to humor. One of the things to look for in Ruddigore is the fact that earlier he had made fun of the Army in the Pirates of Penzance, in the Navy, in HMS Pinafore. He made fun of women's rights and liberation and education in Princess Ida, made fun of the police in the Pirates of Penzance, the House of Lords in Iolanthe. But what he did is he went back in his theatrical history and made fun of Victorian melodrama in Ruddigore. Melodrama, that kind of work where you have the top-hatted villain with the handlebar mustache. You remember the early silent movies with the girls in the sawmills or lashed to the railroad tracks. You always know where you stand in melodrama. And this is why it was so popular in Victorian London. You know, they didn't have televisions back then. And all these working class people, they had to do something after they got off of the day's work, and they went to the theater. And they weren't interested in subtlety. They wanted their comedy broad, and they wanted their drama understandable. So you had real villains, really bad guys, heroes, all good, heroines were all good. But Gilbert took melodrama and, as he always did, turned it on its head. Listen carefully to Ruddigore, and you'll hear this beautiful girl that she calls herself Sweet Rose Maybud. And she is, until she has to decide which of 3 men she wants to marry. Listen to the Jolly Jack Tar. He was another staple of melodrama. He was right off the ship, and he spoke in nautical diction and metaphors. A parody of so many, particularly of Black-Eyed Susan, Douglas Jerrold's perhaps greatest nautical melodrama of all kind, written 50 years at least before Ruddigore. Well, he speaks up in his sailor-like fashion and always says he'll do what he'll do until enlightened self-interest kicks in. And then he does what's best for him, not for his foster brother. The villain of the piece is actually, he does his villainy early in the day so he can get it over with, and then he does good. And the true villain of the piece is masqueraded in Red Area, in this town that we'll see in Act 1, as a virtuous young farmer. So you have all these, and also you have the wronged woman. In melodrama, there was often the case of often a character, such as the woman who had gone insane from unrequited love. And we'll meet her in spades in the middle of Act 1. And one of the most memorable characters that Gilbert ever created, Mad Margaret, and also with one of the perhaps best arias that Sullivan ever created for a character. So with melodrama, you always know where your sympathy is, but be careful where you place it here, because you might find yourself changing midway through. And that's part of the fun of Gilbert's approach to melodrama. So it's been the black sheep of the family, but I think I remember seeing a production of it, the D'Oyly Carte Opera Company, still on the road back in 1966 with my wife of 50 years. She's on the back row back there. Hi, Alice. We went down to the National Theater in Washington, D.C. on a Friday night and saw the D'Oyly Carte. I got jealous because she kept talking about this guy named David Palmer that played Dick Dauntless, the sailor. Well, he was a lot better looking than I. Sang better than I do, too. But I married her. So those are some reflections on Ruddigore, and we really hope you enjoy it. I want to tell you a little bit about, are there any questions? Do you have any questions? Yes. I beg your pardon? To Ruddigore. We sort of know that Queen Victoria was not particularly amused about HMS Pinafore and works like that, but I don't recall anything on the record about about Ruddigore. It had when a friend told W.S. Gilbert that it was a failure, he said, well, it put 7,000 pounds in my pocket and I could use with a few more such failures. And so they were very practical men of the theater. They thought they were writing to make a buck, and they were, or a pound sterling, and they were, but I think they were writing for immortality. Yes?
Is this the first time Ruddigore has been performed here in Austin?
Oh, no. Gilbert and Sullivan Austin did a production of it down at one of the high schools south of Austin in 2007. And my understanding is there were at least 2 productions in the 1980s and 90s, long before I appeared on the scene. So, yes, the company here tries to do most of the works in rotation in order to share these delights with as many people as possible. 76 and 90? Okay, well, if you read in the program our tribute to dear Enid Halleck, who passed away recently, I think she was one of the Dame Hannahs, and that was one of her signature roles. So, well, I thought I'd talk just very briefly, since my time is running pretty quickly here, about our process. Bill Hatcher, our production manager, thanks to email and telephones, is in touch with me. I live in Virginia and commute down here to stage these shows. And for instance, last October we picked out the drop that we rented for Act 1. We're talking about prop lists. We're talking about costume plots, and coordinating with the people in Winnipeg, Canada, that in recent years have provided our costumes. We're very delighted with what they've brought to our shows. And then Jeffrey Jones-Radona, my musical collaborator, and we hold auditions in February, and then I go back to Virginia, and the company learns the score, literally. And then I come back in May. I arrived, I think it was on the 14th of May, and started staging. We hold about 8 3-hour rehearsals a week, calling different people to them as we break the show down, so that if you're in the male chorus, you don't have to come each time. And then after about 3 weeks of that, we put them all together, and we moved into the theater on the 15th of May, I note, and started with our tech rehearsals and final rehearsals with piano and costume, full props, and then we add the orchestra on Tuesday night, and then we had 4 performances last week, and we'll have 5 performances this week. After the Sunday afternoon show is over, we'll have a strike. The company will help us tear apart the set. Out it goes. The rental items returned on Monday, and we all spend a lot of time hugging each other and realizing that we had an awfully good time getting to know each other and working on a project like this, and hope that next year will come around pretty soon, because we're looking forward to a production of Iolanthe. And I see, whenever I mention the name, I see heads go like this, so I don't have to tell you that it's one of the most beautiful of all of Sullivan's scores. And that'll be the show next year. Yes, sir?
How many Gilbert and Sullivan societies do you work with?
Well, this is the one that I'm sort of permanently associated with. A couple years ago, they established the position of artistic director and appointed me to that. That way I don't have to call down and say, am I coming back next year? But this is the only one. But since working here, I've also had a chance to direct a couple Gilbert plays for the Shreveport Gilbert and Sullivan Society, one for the Virginia Commonwealth University Opera Theater. And I stay about as busy as I really want to be. Alice back there, whenever I tell people I'm retired, she just laughs. But you know what? I'm a very fortunate fellow. Because if you really live and breathe this stuff, which I guess I do, to have a chance to come down to Austin and work with a company like this that's willing to raise the money and do the hundreds of other things necessary so that we can present this to you tonight, I'm a pretty lucky fellow, particularly when they let me do them the way that I want to do them, which is the way Gilbert did them. If you've not seen a traditional production before, you'll find that the dance is different. This is not Godspell, it's not Man of La Mancha, it's Gilbert and Sullivan. And the dance is designed to get those words out. The works were written before amplification. We use amplification now. But still the idea is communication. It's not satisfactory just to hear the music. Both Sullivan wanted his music heard and understood, and Gilbert wanted his words. And so thus they let me stage them the way Gilbert staged them. Ironically, a lot of the quirky little dances and the interpolations or additions to the text have come down by tradition for 125 years, but they've never been published anywhere. And those of us that know these things, what one of my friends called where all the diamonds are buried, we're getting older. So what I'm hoping is that we're passing these things on to another generation so that when Ruddigore is staged down here in 25 years, perhaps some of the same delights that are here that wouldn't otherwise be known will be preserved. Yes, ma'am. Oh no, we've been here about 5 or 7 years, and we've done a summer show here for the last 5, 6, 7 years.
Gilbert and Sullivan, Austin started in 1976.
We are 42 years old, and my understanding is that we're the second oldest continuously performing theatrical company in the live music capital of the world. Somebody else told me something kind of interesting. This is the live, I don't have to tell you, this is the live music capital of the world, right? But I understand that our group is one of 3 in the live musical capital of the world where a trained singer can stand on a stage and sing with an orchestra in a pit. 3. Austin Opera, Gilbert Summer Musical, and Gilbert and Sullivan Austin. We're delighted you're here. We hope you have a wonderful time. We have tickets to sell for our last 3 performances, 2 tomorrow and 1 on Sunday. And if you like what you see tonight, and I'm pretty confident you will, do us a favor, call some of your friends, tell them all about it. You are our single best communicator in terms of public relations and selling tickets. And we'd like to share these joys with as many people as possible. Thank you for being here tonight, and enjoy the show.